Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Sunday, 3rd September. It will be mostly cloudy with rain in the evening, with highs of 16 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6 a.m. and sunset at 7:36 p.m. We are on the 34th day of the Warsaw Uprising and the Soviets are back at it again with more propaganda. Roger will update us a little later, but what else is happening, Alina?
Thanks for that, Philippe. Right, I am going to start with a pretty epic success by the Warsaw Uprising insurgents. So this happens in the Campinos Forest. I've spoken about it before, in the northwest part of Warsaw. And this includes a lot of the villages around the area. So the first clashes with the Rona Brigade happen there on August the 28th, and those of you who still don't know who the Rona Brigade is, please head to episode 4 and episode 5 or day 4 and day 5 where we talk a little bit more about the Rona Brigade. So basically sadists of sadists, and they end up going to the Campinos Forest basically, and the first clashes take place on the 28th of August just below the Campinos Forest in a village called Truskaw. The patrol capture several rifles, a horse, and the major of the area is informed about a new enemy that has advanced into the Campinos Forest, so they try and block the whole area. Basically, it's on this day where... Well, it's because the Rona Brigade become an actual threat to the insurgents who are based in that area, in the villages and in the forests around it. Between the 29th of August and the 2nd of September, Rona forces attack the various villages supported by German artillery and aviation. There are high losses of 21 insurgents killed and 35 wounded, but the insurgents hold their position and basically repel all the attacks. So more or less over 4 days of fighting, the Rona Brigade record between 50 to 60 dead and 38 wounded. But there are now more of them advancing into the Campinos Forest. So this threat needs to be eliminated. This threat needs to be taken out. So the commander of the area decides to choose the village of Truskaw, where, according to various intelligence reports, an infantry battalion, a Rona infantry battalion, and an artillery battery are quartered. So he selects 80 soldiers, among them various different volunteers, decide to attack the village, which is occupied by the Rona, and they try to eliminate as many of them as possible. This is a typical type of action that was taken out by these partisans, by these insurgents who operated in this area. They've successfully managed to do these sorts of actions quite a few times in the past, so they were very confident that this was going to happen. So it's over the night of September the 2nd and the early hours of September the 3rd. The attack is divided into 3 groups. There are guides who knew the area, exactly where to go, where they were, and they ended up in the village of Truskaw. They attacked various sections that were assigned to them, and this was a simultaneous attack. It was a complete surprise, and the Rona Brigade were quickly eliminated. They were killing the Rona men while they were asleep because they'd often be heavily drunk from the night before. And then those who did survive, most of them fled. And those who did flee were shot down with machine guns and grenades. The Rona Brigade were held responsible for what happened in Wola and Ochota. And this was an act of also revenge by the Polish insurgents. You've got to remember, emotions are running high. They know what happened in Ochota and Wola, and they had to pay it back somehow. So according to estimates by the Polish command, about 250 Rona Brigade were killed and about 100 wounded. They managed to capture, which is incredible, a 75mm field gun, 2 heavy mortars, 13 light machine guns, a dozen or so more other machine guns, and loads of small arms and other forms of weaponry. What they couldn't take, they destroyed, including several guns and 30 ammunition carts. And there were 8 insurgents who were killed and 10 wounded. This was a very successful raid on Truskaw village. So the following night is when it happens all over again. And this time it's with an 80-person assault attack, which consisted predominantly of volunteers. This time they attacked the village of Mirianów, where there was another Rona company stationed, and it was attacked on the night of the 3rd to the 4th of September by several battle groups. And they were again divided into sections, and they more or less did exactly the same as they did the night before. Simultaneous attack of small groups onto the farms where the Rona men were quartered, and it was a complete surprise. And Captain Marian Podgoreczny remembers this action, and he says the fight lasted about half an hour. The Uhlans passed through the village like a hurricane, shooting at the Vlasovites, or the Rona Brigade, because they referred to the Vlasovites as the Rona Brigade, running out of their huts in their long johns and shirts, half conscious due to the sudden rousing from sleep, and incidentally taking their entire platoon into captivity. The attack ended with complete success, the partisans taking the captured weapons with them immediately after one of the soldiers fired a white rocket, the signal of the end of the action. They turned straight back to the forest where they had left their horses. There were 60 Rona Brigade that were killed in the fight, 24 were taken prisoner. Now, what's very interesting here is those prisoners would be stripped of all their possessions, and those prisoners of war who were found to have stolen items from Warsaw were shot on the spot. The insurgents in this action suffered 3 dead and 5 wounded. They also gained another light machine gun, another larger machine gun, 4 horses, and a lot of military equipment. This was another very successful mission for the insurgents in the Campinos forest. The Rona Brigade had now suffered, in the space of 2 nights, serious losses. Not just losses of life, but losses of equipment. They were completely broken. Their morale was already low at this stage because they'd been kicked out of the main part of the city. Derlevanga's brigade is still functioning in the old town on this day, still carrying out massacres. They're still taking part in the fighting. The Rona Brigade, they've been dismissed. They've been kind of swept to the side and moved over to the Campinos forest, which is not as important for the Germans as the centre part of the Warsaw is. So now they are forced to completely withdraw from the Campinos forest. And then finally, what else is happening on the ground in the main part of the city? I'll be very quick on this one. Powiśle is the next one in the firing line, which is the next district below the old town. That is the intended target of artillery fire, which is specifically focused on the power plant. The power plant, we haven't talked about that in quite a few days, or actually probably in about 30 odd days, and it has still been functioning. It's still been providing power to the city of Warsaw, or the districts that it could be providing power to. Right now, in the next couple of days, it is going to be heavily targeted by the German artillery, and it will be from that moment that the power station goes down and power is completely cut off from the city. There are intense fightings in the Śródmieście, the Midtown district. Again, heavy shelling, artillery, Luftwaffe, Stukas, and constant bombings. The old town has now been captured. Sadyba has now been captured. The districts that are still standing for now are the Midtown, so Śródmieście, Żoliborz in the north, Mokotów in the south, and for probably the next 3 days is going to be Powiśle, and we'll be coming back to the Powiśle district, basically. But Claire, you're going to touch on what's happening in the hospitals on this day, aren't you?
Yes, I mean, the hospitals, it's partly through actions like the one you described against the Rona Brigade that they are supplementing the medical supplies that they have. And the hospitals at this point are amazingly well supplied. They've still got some of the stockpiled medicines and resources from before the uprising. They've been sending people out to requisition more from shops and people's homes, even from the university, had stocks that could be used. And of course, there's the captured German supplies. And so by now, the Home Army has created a number of field hospitals, mainly in basements near the best water supplies and so on. But they are being overwhelmed by casualties, both casualties from the Home Army, of course, and Polish civilians and German prisoners of war as well. It's interesting. I mean, the bulletin that you mentioned, it's Robotnik Worker, the Socialist Party bulletin during the uprising. And they had a report which shows their intense pride in the provision of medical care, even in the 5th week of the uprising. They note here that we have about 100 medical facilities and 20 hospitals, all created from scratch, often on people's individual initiatives. And they're very keen to make the point that they're also treating enemy prisoners of war. So they say, the wounded enemy are in a special hospital and we care for them just like the wounded Poles. Of course our doctors take care of them. Meanwhile, the Germans suffer from a serious shortage of medical personnel. So when they occupied the Maltese hospital, they retained the Polish medical staff. And again, that they begin to contrast the behaviour of their medical units with the German behaviour. So they say our medical units behave honourably. There is no task that the staff have not completed, even though the Germans do not respect the Red Cross armbands and shoot at people carrying stretchers. So the medical staff are getting recognition in the bulletins that's going out to people during the uprising, but they're also getting awards, military awards, for their service. And this bulletin also notes that out of 198 crosses of bravery, 3 were awarded to doctors and 16 to nurses. So there is this way of keeping the morale of the medical staff going, making sure that they are recognised, trying to supplement the medicines and the medical supplies that they have. But at the same time, the hospitals are beginning to be overwhelmed.
Claire, that was really fascinating. Thank you so much for that. We're kind of going to stick on the same topic though, aren't we, really, with Roger and the Soviet propaganda. So we might as well continue going on with that.
So there's an interesting development in the Soviet narrative of the Warsaw Rising on the 3rd of September. And it's not that the elements of this weren't sort of aired before, but you can see with various sort of sources, which I'll talk about in a moment, you can see a sort of, if you like, a crystallization of that Soviet narrative as to, what the Rising is. And there's a couple of sources on this day. One of them is a TASS statement, so the Soviet news agency, which quotes an American, Polish-American trade unionist. And it sort of gives one of those strands of the narrative, which is that he says that it's the emigres or the government in exile in London who are the ones who are essentially causing the problem. They're the ones that says they're not interested in expelling the Germans from Warsaw. They only want to create a situation where they can point the finger at the Red Army for not helping. So again, this idea of sort of pointing the finger constantly at the government in exile, Polish government in exile in London, which is a very strong strand of the Soviet narrative. Almost everything has to rebound to the detriment of the government in exile. And the second source, or the second strand of this, comes from Rzeczpospolita, the famous Polish newspaper, but now being republished in Lublin. So again, under the auspices of the Committee for National Liberation, inverted commas, basically the Moscow Poles. And again, they're pointing the finger not only at the government in exile in London and the commander-in-chief there, General Sosnkowski, but also at General Bolkomorowski, the commander in Warsaw. And there was this constant narrative in a lot of the Soviet propaganda where they would say, where is General Bohr? Why isn't he in Warsaw? Of course, he was in Warsaw all the time, right? But they were constantly sort of playing on this idea that he wasn't in Warsaw, that he was somehow absent and therefore, illegitimate because he's not there for the fight and so on. Later on, this would sort of crystallize out to, an open accusation that General Bohr was actually a war criminal from the Soviets, which is kind of insane. But this is another sort of essential part of that argument, of that narrative, was that again it's the government in exile that to blame, and specifically Bolkomorowski in Warsaw. And the last element of that comes from that same issue actually, and it's an anonymous report from Warsaw itself. I mean, whether that's a genuine thing or not is open very much to interpretation. But the key strand of that particular report is that it claims that the people of Warsaw themselves are outraged at the leaders of the Home Army for starting the uprising without consulting the outside world, without consulting the Soviet Union, which is not true, without proper preparations, which was kind of impossible. I mean, the preparations that they did put in place in the circumstances were kind of remarkable, and without sort of the consent of the Western Allies and the Soviets, which again is just not true. But you can see how this isolation and the beginnings of pointing the finger at not only at the Home Army in Warsaw, but also by extension at the government in exile in London, is beginning to crystallise out at this point, which is quite an interesting development of that narrative.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us on day 34. At least I'll get the dates right this time, unlike I did last episode. So we're on day 34. Thank you for listening, and we will see you tomorrow for day 35, which will be the 3rd of September. And don't forget, if you do like us, rate us. We'll be really appreciative for that. Thanks so much, everyone.